I'm Jennifer Moffat, the circulation aide here at the Belgrade Library. I'm filling in for Sarah Creech. I'd like to make announcements first. The bathroom and emergency exits are in the back to the right. Second, please take a moment and silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. And finally, please complete a survey before leaving this evening. Doing so helps the library, Wonderlust, and sponsors know what programs bring the most interest and help us improve every time. So without further ado, tonight's presenter, Dr. Rob Maher from Montana State University.
Well, good evening, everybody. If I speak at this loudness, is that audible? I'm looking to the people in the back. Cannot hear me? Okay. Or is that a little better? Okay. Okay, if at any time you can't hear or need my attention, please wave. I'll be happy to hear about that. So just a few things to kind of get started here. One of the questions might be, well, what is this young whippersnapper doing talking about 1968? And besides, he's a darn engineer. Okay. So the story of why I'm here is a little bit complicated, of course, but there's a variety of reasons I'm very interested in learning more about 1968. And if I talk to my students at the university, I usually remind them that I'm not necessarily the expert in everything, but I'm an expert learner. And what that means is that I'm eager to learn more things. And tonight, assuming I manage my time properly, we'll have some time for discussion, and you can set me straight on various things. But in any case, we're sort of at this point where 50 years has gone by since the late 60s. And I teach a lot of students now who are barely born in the 21st century, and many of them have various assumptions about the way the world is, and it's quite different than people of a certain age have. So for instance, back at the 2016 presidential election, there were many students very concerned about the end of the world being upon us and so forth. And I was thinking to myself, there was a time when there were assassinations in this country going on during political campaigns. And so, thankfully, knock on wood, we did not have that occurring in 2016. I think if we can survive some of these really, really wrenching and horrendous times in our history, we can certainly get through what we're going through now. And hopefully those of you of a certain age are able to help the younger people understand that and calm them down, and certainly that's what I'm trying to do as well. So my plan for tonight is to give a few more introductory remarks. The plan is to go through 1968 kind of in a calendar fashion and bring up several issues and items and events that happened during that important year and talk a little bit about them, and I hope that'll allow us to reflect a little bit on our current age and what's to come in the future, and to try to have a little bit of perspective that we can gain from that. I think a few of you here are probably over 60 years old. Okay, so again, somewhat different audience than I usually have when I'm talking to college students, and that's great. I'm really, as I say, delighted to be here tonight. We'll have a brief break at that point, and then we'll convene again and talk about a few areas as time permits. I'm particularly interested in the Apollo NASA program that was prominent in 1968. We'll talk a little bit about Apollo 8 in particular, and some of the music and entertainment things and trends that happened back then, and then a few concluding remarks. And I believe we have until 7:30, is that correct? Do I get a big hook at that time, or the trap door, or sock it to me or something? Oh, you'll all be asleep. Okay, good. Well, we'll listen to some music here, so that'll be good. So first of all, let's kind of go back to 1968. I was laughing when you were told to silence your cell phones. You know, that's not something that people would likely have even contemplated at that time. How many of us would have thought we would have a little device we carry around that allows us to call long distance anywhere in the world walking down the street? You know, that's a magical kind of thing which we completely take for granted now, and your children and grandchildren definitely take completely for granted. Okay, so it's not even something that they've contemplated. So 1968, the start of the year, the Academy Awards happened, and here's some of the films that were out at that time. So In the Heat of the Night, Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Dolittle, The Graduate, a very important film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And the first one there, In the Heat of the Night, was the Academy Award winner that year, and Best Actor Oscar went to Rod Steiger. Do you know the other prominent actor in the Heat of the Night? Sidney Poitier. Okay, and you also notice Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? If some of you may remember that movie, that also featured Sidney Poitier. And he was in a third movie around that time. Do you know which one that was? To Sir with Love was also that same year. So, and interestingly enough, he was 40 years old in 1968. He always seemed very young at the time, but he was 40, so interesting. Now, the movies that were in the theaters at that time included 2001: A Space Odyssey. So if you went to the movies in 1968, that would be a new film just coming out. Planet of the Apes, another space movie, a little dystopian kind of view. The Odd Couple, Bullet, the movie about the big car chase in San Francisco and so forth. The Green Berets, John Wayne trying to make a statement there. And The Love Bug, which I think I remember going to see the next year when it was out with The Jungle Book at a drive-in theater. Okay. Another thing that don't hear a whole lot about. So In the Heat of the Night, if you're familiar with the plot of that film, Sidney Poitier was a New York detective who was traveling through this town of Sparta, Mississippi, and got entangled in a murder investigation. It turned out he was a detective, a murder detective from New York, and ended up dealing with all of the issues associated with that time and that place. And the movie has aged very well. If you haven't seen it recently, I'd recommend watching it again. It's actually quite good. 2001, another important movie that was out at that time and has come back after we passed the year 2001. And 1968, I think people maybe imagined actually it would have been possible in 2001 to have all of those things going on, and we know better now. And then Planet of the Apes, this movie with Charlton Heston has been remade recently. I've not seen the new version of it, but I certainly remember the older version there. Now, let's listen to a little bit of music and see if you can remember, some of you, or some of this music that you might have heard before. And I'm going to have to play with a level here, so please excuse me if it's too loud or too soft to start with. So we'll come back to that one later. That's one of my key interests. I'm an engineer, and I'm interested in electronic music, and that was one of the first albums that used the Moog synthesizer, and we'll tie that up a little bit later. Okay, so if you go to films nowadays, if they want to show things about and get you in the mood of what was happening in the 1960s, of course, music will be a big part of that. So hopefully this is giving a little bit of a setting of this is the kind of things that we were doing and talking about at that era. Okay, now just a little bit of a warning here. As I was going through this and looking at some of the images and so forth, 1968 is recognized as a very violent and troubling year. And so some of the images and some of the topics that we'll be discussing tonight are not happy and they're not good. And so I just want you to be aware of that as the images come up. That I'm not doing this just to be shocking or something. It's just that was part of the era. So please understand that as we go along here. But before we do that, let's start with a different subject.
You forgot about my favorite movie star who celebrated his 40th birthday last year.
Who's that?
Mickey Mouse, you ding-dong.
Mr. Mouse, congratulations on your long movie career.
Gosh, thank you, Goldie.
I've often wondered, you and Minnie Mouse have been going together for such a long time. Haven't you ever thought about marriage or children or anything?
Oh, the same old problem. Minnie's afraid of mice.
Oh, poor baby. Has that ever broken up your romance?
Yes, but we managed to revive it.
How'd you do that?
Mouse-to-mouse resuscitation.
Another thing about your fans and everything, we've always kind of wondered, is that your real voice?
No, I really sound like this. Mr. Disney said it wasn't good for talkies.
That's funny. Dick and Dad said the same thing about my voice. It isn't good for TV.
No kidding. Now, what's your real voice sound like, Goldie?
Well, there goes one of the greats.
Yeah.
So Laughin appeared January 1968. This new show, very influential in many respects. It was filmed in segments, not as a continuous show, and that way they could film over and over and over a bunch of things and then piece it together for the actual broadcast. And so that allowed them to have a very low cost of this. A bunch of one-liners. Another show that came out the next year that was along these lines was called Hee Haw. Remember Hee Haw? It was a country version kind of this. Many of the players in Laughin, the TV show, went on to do other things and were very recognized in different things. I included Lily Tomlin in the upper left corner there as Ernestine, the operator. It's hard to explain sometimes to people what an operator was. But I think Lily Tomlin was in Bozeman not long ago at the Ellen for a show, so even after all this time. Another comment I remember from this era was this: "It may be rice wine to you, but it's still sake to me," which then led to this "sock it to me" part of the show where they would dump water on somebody or punch them. And Richard Nixon, in fact, later in 68 during the campaign, appeared on Laughin and said, "Sock it to me," and this was this huge thing, and some people even credit his win in the presidential election, we'll talk about later, for the fact that he appeared on Laughin and sort of, broke the ice a little bit. The other comment I always remember was, "You bet your sweet bippy," was a term that came out of that era as well. Now, January 1968 also had another very pivotal event that is related to some of the things in our news here today. Some of you maybe remember the USS Pueblo. So the Pueblo was a Navy ship. It was near North Korea, and actually then North Korean patrol boats captured the sailors on that vessel, killed one of them in the process of shooting on them. The Pueblo was not armed in such a way to defend itself, and the 83 members were held hostage for almost the whole year. They were finally released in December. The North Koreans still have the vessel. So even now, when we're negotiating with North Korea on other things, they still have that boat in a museum or kind of in their harbor there after all this time. The photo in the lower left, you may notice an interesting gesture that a few of the sailors have. So the North Koreans sent out these propaganda photos, and several of the sailors were giving the finger to the camera to show that they were, not wanting to be in the picture. And apparently they told the North Koreans that this was the Hawaiian happy gesture. The North Koreans eventually figured out what it really meant, and the soldiers really were beaten up and treated poorly after that incident. But all but the one who was killed were eventually released at the end of the year. January 1968 also was in the midst of the Vietnam War, of course, and it was noted for a situation in which up to that time the reports from the U.S. government had been that the war was in control and was going to be won soon and everything was fine. And then during the season of Tet, which was the Vietnamese New Year, 70,000 North Vietnamese invaded all areas of South Vietnam, including even in Saigon. And although the North Vietnamese were repelled and it was a terrible defeat to them on a military standpoint, the fact that this news got out after people had thought that the war was almost over and now they had this event happen was a big deal. And Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, had to deal with the results of that. The Tet Offensive, towns like Khe Sanh and Hue, these Vietnamese villages, suddenly become things that people are aware of. Shortly after this, there was a quote from the Associated Press of a military officer who said, "It became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it," which was meant in a certain way, but once it's portrayed out of context, this was a very inexplicable message that came out at that time and certainly made people uncertain about whether they should trust what the government had to say at that period of time. 1968 was a big year as far as military strength. This is the graph that shows the military personnel. So over 500,000 U.S. troops were in South Vietnam in 1968. That was the peak of the deployment of soldiers to South Vietnam. I think during the first Gulf War, the deployment in the Middle East was approximately the same size. So there were a lot of soldiers there, but you can see this was a big deal. And also, if you go to visit Washington, D.C. and see the Vietnam Memorial, the wide part of the memorial where the largest number of casualties were present is 1968 also. So that was the year in which all of this really started to come home, and people started really being in a situation where they were concerned about what was going on in Southeast Asia. February 1968.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bussed across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
That was advertisement during the presidential campaign in 1968. George Wallace had been a Democrat and actually tried to run for president in 1964. But in 68 he came out as an independent, and he was known primarily for his populist and racist views. When he had been governor of Alabama, in his inaugural address, he famously said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." That was the message in an inaugural address. In June of that year, there was a famous showdown at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, where Wallace stood at the door to prevent integration of that campus. And so his heritage came from this very racist, segregationist kind of background, and the fact that he was taken seriously as a candidate tells you a lot about what was going on in the country at that time in the 60s. Is this a familiar face to people?
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months, we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
And did the best they could. So after Cronkite had made this editorial, which was very, very unusual for the news at that time. Ordinarily, Walter Cronkite would give the news, and he would end his news broadcasts with, "And that's the way it is." You know, Thursday, March 21st, this is Walter Cronkite, good evening. He didn't say, "And that's the way it is," after that, and part of it is the symbolic that he was not stating that as news, he was stating that as his opinion. But Walter Cronkite at the time and after was recognized as the most trusted man in America, and the political leaders noticed that if Walter Cronkite was now saying there was some question about whether we were going to be victors in this war, that was going to be highly influential, and in fact it was. So in March of that year, March of 68, after the Tet Offensive had been underway and all the other things that were happening, Gene McCarthy had entered the race for president. So 68 was an election year. Everyone assumed that Lyndon Johnson would run again. He had received 61% of the vote in 1964 against Goldwater. So he was extremely popular in 64. This is 4 years later, and the tables have just turned decidedly. Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, challenged him and received 42% of the vote during the primary in New Hampshire. Robert Kennedy had been kind of biding his time and didn't want to enter the race at first, but when he saw how well McCarthy was doing and that there was a possibility that Johnson was beatable in the election, he decided to enter the contest. And so I'll play a little bit of his speech here.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities, policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white, between rich and poor, between young and old, in this country and around the rest of the world. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war.
So hearing his voice and hearing his entry into the race, again, the public was now facing kind of a Democratic Party that had various factions, various interests. George Wallace was on the scene. This just added to that sense of not being clear about what the rules were anymore and about how things were going to go into the future. So then March of 1968. So it was not actually known in March 1968 that a massacre had taken place by U.S. ground forces at the city or the village of My Lai. It wasn't known for about another year, but it was at the same time that a lot of the frustrations and misunderstandings that were taking place, the massacre did occur. And that wrenching review of what happened, why it happened, the court-martials, the trials and so forth after that, really played out over the next many years, and it's a sad legacy of the Vietnam War. One of the remarks that came out of the proceedings were, they're all VC, or Viet Cong, now go and get them. Who is my enemy? Anybody that was running from us, hiding from us, or appeared to be the enemy. If a man was running, shoot him. Sometimes even if a woman with a rifle was running, shoot her. So the troops who had been accustomed to the idea of having a World War II style battle were now faced with an insurgency. And of course that seems to be the style of warfare even up until today around the world. And was certainly what was being faced in Vietnam at that time. So all of this turmoil, all of this concern, and in the midst of that, Lyndon Johnson on March 31st gave a televised address in which he spent about 35 or 40 minutes talking about how they were conducting the war in Vietnam. And at the very end of that address, this is what he said.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. good night, and God bless all of you.
The response to Johnson not entering the race was profound. So the understanding of the country not really being on its normal mode of operation and that things being very strange and different and not being able to trust the institutions of government was starting to fray at this point.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of his second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said, Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something.
So, wrenching, terrible event. The context here was back in February of 1968, 2 sanitation workers in Memphis had been killed in a malfunctioning garbage truck, two black men. The rest of the sanitation workers went on strike. Many of them were carrying signs that read, "I am a man." And you may see these photos of them marching. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders came to the city in March, and we're going to organize a protest. That protest turned very violent. 4,000 National Guard troops were deployed, and it was just a melee. Dr. King had to be kind of taken away from the scene, or he would have gotten caught up in this himself. April 3rd, the day before he was assassinated, he returned to Memphis, and you heard part of his remarks that night before. He also said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." So very startling and prophetic words from him the night before that he was assassinated in Memphis. So later that month, now in all of this disarray and uncertainty about what was going to happen and who was in charge and what was going on, the Vice President, Hubert Humphrey, also from Minnesota, decided to enter the race for president. And this was very late. If you can imagine, in our current presidential election cycle, having somebody enter the race in April for a November election just wouldn't work. But in these days, of course, with the party system and how things went, that was certainly feasible. Humphrey was noted for being a very good person, a solid person, a respected person, but not a very charismatic individual in many respects. But he did enter the race and was going to presumably now be up against Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy for the Democratic rest of the primary season. Also in April, meanwhile, with all of this other stuff going on, there was Broadway in New York.
Don't ask me why, don't know.
So the hippies had now become part of the culture in the sense that you could have a Broadway show about them. So Herod started off Broadway and was so popular, and the music was so kind of catchy, and the theme was sort of interesting, that it actually then became a long-running Broadway play, and then many years later a movie, and you know, you still hear about it and see things that are going on from that time. So again, it's, to me, looking back, it's startling that you think, well, Martin Luther King had just been assassinated, for goodness sake, and now you're opening a Broadway musical. But life was going on somehow in the midst of all of the things that we saw that were a problem. Here's the Great Falls Tribune in May of 1968, and it has a hopeful headline, "Peace Talks Set to Begin Today."
I was informed about 1 o'clock this morning that Hanoi was prepared to meet in Paris on May the 10th, or several days thereafter. After conferring with Secretary of State and Defense, and Ambassador Goldberg and Ball, and Secretary Harriman, and Mr. Vance, I have sent a message informing Hanoi that the date of May the 10th and the site of Paris are acceptable to the United States.
So Lyndon Johnson, of course, didn't run for election, but he was still president. And so he was still doing presidential things, and one of them was to try to engage the North Vietnamese in peace talks. So this was 1968. The hope was it would be over maybe by Christmas. And how much longer did the Vietnam War go? 7 years. 1975. And so we saw the chart earlier about the deaths that were occurring in Vietnam. So the hopefulness of this period, at least people thought maybe this was something good that will happen, didn't follow along.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy, at the time of his death, were his wife Ethel, his sisters Mrs. Stephen Smith, Mrs. Patricia Lawford, brother-in-law Mr. Stephen Smith, her sister-in-law Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old.
So after all that, Robert Kennedy, who had entered the race for president, had just won the California Democratic primary, made some remarks at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, was being escorted out through the kitchen, and Sirhan Sirhan, assassin, was waiting for him and killed him there. The notion that people had now of this is a routine thing. Every few months, a prominent political figure is going to be assassinated. From now on, never again? You know, what's going to happen? So this sort of uncertainty and blackness that was sort of hanging out there was really hard to explain in any really good and meaningful way at the time. Now, Lyndon Johnson was continuing on as president, and one of the important things that he did during this period was to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with many countries of the world. At that time, in 1968, 18 countries signed this treaty. It arose in many respects out of the Cuban Missile Crisis a few years earlier, when there was a fear that misunderstandings or bad communication or other things might lead inadvertently to the start of a nuclear war. And I think that was a valid concern then, as it would be today. At that time, there were 5 original nuclear states. So besides the United States, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, and China. And since that time, there are now additional nuclear states, including India, Pakistan, North Korea, possibly Israel. And none of them have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty because they violated it by developing nuclear weapons. The only other country that hasn't signed it is South Sudan, and maybe somebody knows why, but they've not signed the treaty. But that's a legacy of the Johnson administration, certainly.
In many ways, 1968 is famous for its tragedies, assassinations, conflicts, and war. But 1968 also gave birth to something amazing, the era of fast, cheap, ubiquitous electronics. Because 50 years ago, this past week, 2 middle-aged engineers quit their jobs to start a new company called Intel.
In 1968, Gordon Moore dropped by Bob Noyce's house. Bob was mowing the lawn. They were discussing the state of their current jobs, as well as the possibility of a new industry.
So in addition to the political turmoil that was going on, the founding of Intel as a company, of course still exists today, was a major deal for those of us in the technical fields. And the idea that you could now have integrated circuits and memory that could fit on a chip and things like that, which again is completely a casual thing for all of us today as we walk around with our mobile phones. That was a new idea and very unexpected. It was so new that even the Apollo spacecraft had 3 transistor integrated circuits in them. That was the cutting edge and what was available at that time. And so a lot has changed, of course, since then. But that started way back in '68.
In the heat of emotion and riot, some policemen may have overacted. But to judge the entire police department by the alleged action of a few would be just as unfair as to judge our entire younger generation by the action of this mob. I would like to say here and now that this administration, our administration, and the people of Chicago have never and will condone brutality at any time, but they will never permit a lawless, violent group of terrorists to menace the lives of millions of people, destroy the purpose of this national convention, and take over the streets of Chicago.
That was Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago. Chicago could be a whole talk in its own as far as the politics of that town in the 1960s and before. Richard Daley, I listened to several of his speeches. He was just very characteristically missing words and kind of futzing up things that he said. You know, he's quoted around the same time saying, "The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder." Okay. And of course he didn't mean that, but these kind of quotes, it was very typical of his kind of minced speech. But more seriously, at the convention, which ultimately nominated Hubert Humphrey and his running mate Edmund Muskie, riots took place in the streets of Chicago with protests over the war and everything else. Racial injustice. The American Indian movement was even active in this period of time, so everybody had a beef and didn't know what to do, and so the riots were taking place. And then on television there were pictures of the convention going on. Meanwhile, there were other pictures of riot police clubbing demonstrators out on the streets. Earlier that month of August, the Republicans had their convention in Miami and nominated Richard Nixon. Nixon had been opposed by a fellow named Ronald Reagan. So he was in the hunt that year, Jim Rhodes and also Nelson Rockefeller. Those were the other candidates. But Nixon picked Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as his running mate, and the contrast between the conduct of the Republican convention in Miami and then what happened in Chicago, again, was a striking contrast that I think many people indicate caused worry about the state of the country. And Nixon referred to the silent majority, which was a code word for people who didn't like all of this disruption and distress, and that was ultimately a lot of the, that we'll see in just a minute, what ended up in the campaign. Now, along with Intel being formed, Boeing introduced an aircraft called the 747. So this large jumbo jet and sort of just now being phased out or moved over into cargo hauling, but still that existed and was new in that time. Now Boeing right now is having some other challenges with a different aircraft, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, but at this time this was the major development of that airplane. And another thing happened, a new TV show came on.
Good evening. This is 60 Minutes. It's a kind of a magazine for television, which means it has the flexibility and diversity of a magazine adapted to broadcast journalism.
And if this broadcast does what we hope it will do, it will report reality.
But we do think this is sort of a new approach. We realize, of course, that new approaches are not always instantly accepted.
We'll see. I'm Mike Wallace.
We will indeed. I'm Harry Reisner.
So that broadcast, again, to them was this big experiment. Will it last? We'll see. I believe it's still on. If you tune in Sunday nights on CBS, you'll still see 60 Minutes. So apparently their experiment was quite a success at that time. Now, what else was going on in 1968? It was an Olympic year, Mexico City Olympics. And one of the prominent results of that Olympics was a remarkable long jump by Bob Beamon, American. He leaped 29 feet 2.5 inches, which was 21 inches farther than the previous record. In fact, they weren't even really set up to measure a jump that long because nobody had even come close to the previous record until Beamon did this jump. His world record in 1968 stood until 1991, and it is still the Olympic record. Nobody's even come close to that in the last several Olympics. And there's a variety of reasons and theories about why that is, but really, really a remarkable leap by Bob Beamon. Another event happened at the Olympics. So at the 200-meter run ceremony, Tommy Smith, gold medalist, who was expected to win that race, and John Carlos, also an American who got the bronze medal, had decided that they wanted to make a protest at the time of the medal ceremony. So they wore black socks, they took off their shoes as a symbolic gesture. They were both supposed to have black gloves, and it turned out, I think, John Carlos forgot his gloves, and so they ended up taking one pair of gloves, and that's why Tommy Smith has a right glove and John Carlos a left glove. And during the playing of the U.S. national anthem, they stood silently, bowed their heads, and held their fists up. Now, in today's era of demonstrations during the playing of the national anthem, we sort of harken back to this time when this was a very big deal. The reaction to this was swift. Both Tommy Smith and John Carlos were kicked out of the Olympic Village and had to turn in their medals. They had death threats, and there's another individual in this picture. Do you see who that is there in the front? I'll say something about him in just a second, the silver medalist.
While supporters praised the athletes' bravery, their protest was largely perceived negatively as a show of disrespect. 2 days after their gesture of protest, Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Olympic Village for allegedly violating the principles of the Olympic spirit. Despite their medal-winning performances, they faced intense criticism and received death threats upon returning home. Gradually, the symbolic importance of their protest came to be more widely recognized. Today, that image of the two men with fists in the air and heads bowed is one of the most enduring symbols of the American civil rights struggle.
So one thing that isn't really well known about this photo, and I've circled on here a little badge that the three athletes are wearing. The badge is from the Olympic Project for Human Rights. This was a group of black athletes who had contemplated boycotting the Olympics entirely in opposition to the racial treatment that they had, but they decided to participate. But both Tommy Smith and John Carlos wore these badges, and when Peter Norman, an Australian unexpected silver medalist, one of the greatest Olympians from Australia in track events, even up through today, heard about this, he wanted to wear one of these medals. And in fact, one of the rowers, I think, from the United States who had one gave him this medal, this badge to wear in the medal ceremony. So although it looks like he's just standing there passively, he's actually participating in the protest. He paid a heavy price for that. He was basically blacklisted from the Olympics. He didn't participate in 1972. But after that, he was still friends with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. In fact, when Peter Norman died in 2006, Smith and Carlos were pallbearers and eulogized him at his event. And Norman said in an interview once, "It has been said that sharing my silver medal with that incident on the victory dais detracted from my performance. But," he said, "on the contrary, I have to confess I was rather proud to be part of it." So even after that time, he felt that it apparently was worth it to him to sort of end his track career with the silver medal, but no longer then being felt that he was appropriate as a representative of Australia. So interesting story I was not aware of. Okay, so November rolls around, and we're getting close to the break. Don't worry. You know how the year works, right? Yeah. Okay. We got to November and the presidential election, and Richard Nixon won the presidential race, but it was super close. It ended up being 43.4% for Nixon and 42.7% for Humphrey. The popular victory margin was only 500,000 votes between those two. George Wallace received almost 10 million votes that year, and he carried 5 states. So as a third-party candidate, that was a pretty significant role. If you start looking at how the pie is carved up there, George Wallace and his role in that election was a pretty big deal. Nixon would go on to win in 1972 by a landslide, but in 68 it was very, very close. Another thing happened in that election in 68.
The following program is brought to you in living color on WNBC TV.
How do you feel being the first black woman, in the House of Representatives?
I have mixed feelings. First of all, I'm very glad to have been able to make history in this country by being the first black woman. And boys and girls, as far as I'm concerned, actually, it's overdue. So I don't get terribly excited about it.
So Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress. It took until 1968 for that to happen. So again, it's not that long ago in the big scheme of things, but a long time ago in other respects. Shirley Chisholm went on to run for president a few times and had a very storied career, but it started during that election in 1968. She was from New York. Now, after all of the turmoil and the election and everything else that was going on, we got to December, and then something interesting to me and to many people happened. And after the break, if we have time to talk about this a little more, I'll say a few more things about the Apollo 8 mission. But Apollo 8 was, as you may remember or want to know, was the first time a spacecraft with people in it left Earth orbit and went out and went around the moon. And it was a very daring and, as we'll see, drastic event. The interesting thing in many respects about it was one of the things that happened on the second orbit of the moon. And I've got the recording here from a cassette tape that was recording on board the spacecraft. Here's what happened.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick. Down here? Just grab me a color. A color exterior. Hurry up. That one?
I'm going to stop it there. It's hard to hear what's going on. So Bill Anders, one of the astronauts, has been dutifully taking photographs out the front of the command module of the moon, because they're preparing for astronauts to go and land there, and so they're taking pictures of what will be the landing site. And so the spacecraft is oriented, pointing down toward the surface of the moon. He happens to glance out of the corner of his eye off a side window and sees the Earth coming up beautiful blue marble, the only color in anywhere out around the spacecraft other than the gray dead moon. And you heard him say, "Ooh, look at that. That's beautiful." But in these days, of course, cameras had film in them. Remember film, this plastic material you had to learn? And they only had so much film on board the spacecraft, and so they couldn't just be taking 20 shots the way we do now with digital cameras. They had to be very careful about that. So he went over with the black and white film he had been using to photograph the surface of the moon and took this photograph, which I think is beautiful. It's extremely detailed, and boy, you zoom in on this, boy, you can spend an hour just looking at the photo. But that was the first photo that he took. And then he said, "I want color film. Find some color film." So they needed the same camera, and they would put a new color film module on there. So the other astronauts are searching around for it. The other funny thing that you might have heard was Frank Borman, the commander, says at one point, "Don't take that photo. It's not in the schedule." Says he was half joking, but it was partly that they only had so many frames of film, and they had a duty to get those photos of the landing site. They shouldn't be taking tourist pictures out the window. Thankfully, they did. Anyway, they went on. When they finally got the color film, Anders took a second shot out a different window. And then now that he got everything set and the exposure right, he took a third photograph. You recognize that one? That one's referred to as Earthrise. And in many ways, it's the legacy of that Apollo 8 mission. In many respects, for the public, is tied up in this one photograph. And people suddenly realized, again, after this terrible year of 1968, the awful things that had happened and the assassinations and so forth, we're all stuck on this little blue marble. And there isn't anywhere else we're going to go. We're all in the same boat, so to speak. And I think this image really captured that feeling, and people really noticed it. The evening of Christmas Eve, the spacecraft was orbiting the moon, and they had scheduled a broadcast in orbit. And the astronauts had decided what they would do to close out that broadcast, being Christmas Eve and all, is they would read from the Christian Bible, or the Judeo-Christian Bible. And so they read from the book of Genesis.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light."
They passed the script to each astronaut, and they read the next segment. And then at the end, Commander Borman finished with this remark.
God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
And we heard first Bill Anders, and then Jim Lovell, and finally Frank Borman reading from the book of Genesis, the Bible, and that final word, good luck, and God bless Earth. They are continuing now around the moon, continuing across the face of the moon, but the dark part of the face of the moon as we view it tonight in that crescent-shaped moon we see from Earth. And they will go around now one more time, and then shortly after 1 o'clock this morning, fire the engines that will return them to Earth. And we will be reporting that, of course.
That was Walter Cronkite, of course. So at the end of the broadcast, no one had expected what was going to happen, and so Cronkite, being a professional, he was just able to talk about it as if it was all in a day's work. But meanwhile, this was very influential in many respects, both politically, spiritually, a lot of different ways that had happened. And also, being America, there were lawsuits about spending money on the radio waves, broadcasting a message from the Bible and so forth. So all of these things are, again, part of that year, 1968. But interestingly enough, Time magazine, which created a issue every year of Man of the Year back in the old days, now Person of the Year. But in 1968, start of 1969, looking back over all of the terrible things that had happened in 1968 and the war and the election and everything else, who did they choose to be Men of the Year but the crew of the Apollo 8? And that message of hope and that maybe we can get out of 1968, get it behind us and get on with the other things that are going to happen. Maybe things will be okay. And so I think the editors of Time thought that was going to be an important message, and I think they were right. Okay, so I've been talking an hour. You have great stamina. That's wonderful. Maybe if we could take a break for 5 minutes, and you can either leave if you like, or I have some more things, and I'd really like to have a discussion up until the end of our time. So, yeah, please, let's take a break. Okay, if you're willing to reconvene. I was joking earlier that they had filled the container with gin, but they didn't. I'm just kidding. Just had a couple other quick comments I wanted to share, and then I'd like to have a little discussion, or if people were willing to bring up some things or correct me or point out some other important facts about the year, that would be really wonderful. I think we'd all benefit from that a lot. One of the things about this Apollo 8 mission that is intriguing to me as sort of a technical historian mostly was understanding a little bit about this time frame of the Apollo mission. And this is a complicated picture, but I'll just point out a couple things on here. So way over at the left is May 1961. That was the speech right after the Alan Shepard had gone into space on the first Mercury launch. And we, the Americans, were trying to catch up to the Soviets at that time and see what we could do. And so Kennedy was very aware of not that a space program was going to somehow be important in some fully tangible way, but as a way to show the strength of and prowess of democracy and the Americans compared to the communists. That was just very clear this needed to be done. So he had decided then that he would make a speech, and a lot of the speech, if you actually read it, is about appropriation. He wants money from Congress, and of course that's what we have to do in America, is the Congress has to appropriate the money for the executive branch to be able to spend it. And so he was asking Congress to appropriate lots of money in 1961. And one of his remarks was, at that time, he's proposing that we are going to send a person to the moon and return them safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. Okay. Now, things happened a lot faster in the 1960s than they do today. I'm just struck with that so many times, and this is one of those examples. So after that was announced, now NASA had recently been declared to exist, and there was people that had various ideas, but as far as all the infrastructure and what you'd really need to do to go to the moon, that really hadn't been figured out yet. And so there was a whole period of saying, well, okay, we know what we want to do, but we have no idea how we're going to do it and what kind of rockets we need and communications and how much oxygen we're going to have to send and food and can people poop in space, and there's all of this stuff had to be figured out. So I got it wrong here. In 1962, I said address to Congress. That was actually an address at Rice University in Houston. This was his address. We choose to go to the moon and do all the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I get goosebumps and choked up when I listen to the recording of that speech, and you can hear it on the internet, about the importance of this work. So the Gemini program, which took place back in the 65, 66 sort of era, that was to figure out a lot of things about how you could go into space, but at the same time, in parallel, they had to get the Saturn rockets ready to actually go to the moon. And they weren't going to be ready yet, but all these other things had to be figured out. I've got little red stars on here. Do you see the stars? Those are the Surveyor spacecraft that were sent to land on the moon because people really didn't even know what the lunar surface was like. Maybe it was dust and the spacecraft would sink down. There was even concern that it might ignite so that the rockets on the landing would cause the whole moon to blow up. I mean, no one really knew what might happen. So these spacecraft and all the missions had to be done to send these robotic spacecraft out to land on the moon and check it out. And so there was a whole series of these Surveyor spacecraft that people don't really think about, but they were really essential in that. Another talk I'll give sometime was about Apollo 12, the second moon landing, when the astronauts walked over to Surveyor 3, which had landed a couple years earlier, and took the camera from it, and you can see the camera at the Smithsonian. So I'm thinking in my life, maybe we will see astronauts on Mars, and maybe they will take a camera from the Viking lander or something like that and bring it back to Earth. Wouldn't that be wonderful to see? But in the midst of this, January 1967 was the Apollo 1 launch pad fire that killed the 3 astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Not even in space. They died in the capsule at the Cape. Huge setback to everything. And after that happened, there was a whole question about, well, was this worth it? Should we even be trying to get to space? Yet the first Apollo Saturn V, the moon rocket launch, occurred in November '67. That same year, toward the end of the year, they launched the first Saturn V to test it out. So the commitment to go was still there despite the loss of those astronauts. The second Saturn V launch was in April of 1968 and was just about a tragedy. The rocket shook like crazy, pieces fell off, they couldn't restart the engine once they got into space, and it looked like maybe there was going to be a problem. Then we get to December 1968, Apollo 8, they're going to send people on this rocket to go around the moon, the same rocket that they had all this trouble with, and that's going to be the third launch of this rocket, the first manned launch, and they're going to go to the moon. Okay. So the willingness to take risks, and I guess it goes with that era of 1968, that things were bad, and it was sort of like, we got to do something. We got to make this happen. We can do it. We're going to have to try to get a little luck out of this. And of course, it was a huge triumph, but it just as easily could have been a major disaster. So the work on that was really, really remarkable. Apollo 8 was supposed to be in Earth orbit originally using the lunar module. They were going to practice all the things of the lunar module, but the lunar module was behind schedule. It wasn't ready. So the Apollo 7 mission had already tested things in Earth orbit, and so rather than just staying in Earth orbit, they said, we're not going to send you with a lunar module, but we're going to let you go around the moon, and of course all these things happened. Now a few flights later, you remember Apollo 13, which was the mission in which the oxygen tank on board the command and service module blew up, and the astronauts relied on the lunar module as the way to get home. It became their lifeboat and their oxygen. Had that accident occurred on Apollo 8, that would have been it. There was no lifeboat. There was no lunar module there. Bill Anders was the lunar module pilot. He still had that title on that mission, but there was no lunar module for him to command. I'm going on and on. Sorry about that. But.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
On that one on 1964, the January 64, the unmanned flight, who was on that? Where was John Glenn?
Oh, so John Glenn and the Mercury launches are back in that earlier period on the yellow section. That's where the Mercury launches were. The Saturn I, that was a Saturn I rocket, not the moon rocket, not the Saturn V, but it was a smaller rocket that was used for these just Earth orbit tests. And that one did not have anybody on it. It had sort of an inactive command module with nobody in it, but they just practiced and tested the heat shield and did a variety of other things. Yeah. So John Glenn would have been back in somebody know?
62.
What? 62. So he was after they had switched from the Redstone, the simple rocket, to the Atlas launch vehicle for the orbital test. So he was the first American to orbit the Earth. The previous ones had just been ballistic up into space and then back down in the ocean.
Well, was the Saturn V designed by von Braun?
Yes, so Werner von Braun was the father, so to speak, of that moon rocket. Okay, one other thing I'll mention, and sorry to be going on and on here, but one of the other things that happened in 1968 that I don't think is really appreciated by many people is that we went from an era in which music that was recorded was live music, and you performed it and held a microphone up and the performers did their thing. And you did one take or two takes and you basically were done. Now the Beatles had been immensely popular, and about 1966 they decided not to tour anymore. I think they were fed up with just these huge crowds everywhere. And so they were going to continue to be a band, and they were going to do studio performances or studio music. Music? Yeah, it became music. And it became music because at this time people started using multi-track tape recorders. And so these were devices that you could play one part, rewind the tape, and while you're playing back that part you previously recorded, you can play another part and record it on a different track on that tape, and you can do this several times. Now the Beatles were very creative themselves, and they also had a very creative producer, George Martin, who was willing to work with them on this, and Jeff Emmerich, a sound audio engineer. This is back when people wore white coats in the sound studio, like lab coats. But anyway, they worked on this and helped develop it. Another thing that happened in 1968 was the release of this album, Switched on Bach, which used a Moog synthesizer. Now, Bob Moog had developed this synthesizer to make electronic sounds and music. He was not much of a musician, but he knew musicians. And Walter Carlos, a musician, was willing to work with this synthesizer that could play one note at a time. So it was not polyphonic, it was monophonic. So Carlos would then play one line of this Bach Brandenburg Concerto, for instance, rewind the tape, adjust the synthesizer, which in those days meant moving patch cords around from place to place, then would record the next line of this, rewind it, and go back. And the big problem was this synthesizer, analog synthesizer, the pitch varied with temperature. And so getting the knobs just right and everything like that required an extremely careful type of person. The other development was that Walter Carlos was actually Wendy Carlos. So there was a transgender aspect of this going on at the same time. So the original album here says Walter Carlos performing this music, but in 1968 Walter became Wendy, and so Wendy then is the person who's still alive now, and the new albums all say Wendy Carlos on them. So again, here in our current era, we're talking about transgender things as if this is some new development that didn't exist before, and here's a very prominent example, even back in the 60s, of what was going on at that time. The other thing, again, from an engineering standpoint, Robert Moog, the inventor of the synthesizer, who I actually got to meet before he died some years ago, he's a person that laughs loudly at his own jokes, which I like. Anyway, in 1968, he gave a paper at the Audio Engineering Society convention in New York City, and here's the description of that. And you notice down here at the end, it says, "New trends rely less on tape splicing," which is cutting the tape and taping it together, "and allow more efficient composition processes. Among these are the use of a multi-track recorder, a system of sequential programmers, and a small digital computer." 1968. Each will be explained and discussed. Well, the story of this is Moog, the Switched on Bach album had not been released yet. So at the end of his talk, he played a tape, and this is what he played. I'll just play a little bit of it here. So there are a variety of what are called timbres, different sound qualities, and if you listen to it carefully, you notice that. And imagine you had ears of 1968 and had never heard electronic sounds or anything like that ever before. Okay, so you're a white man with a tie in New York City. You're an engineer at the Audio Engineering Society convention. Bob Moog says, "I put the tape on." So this is at the end of his talk. I put the tape on and I wanted to let it run. So I just walked off the stage into the back of the room, and I can remember people's mouths dropping open. I swear I could see a couple of those cynical old bastards starting to cry. At the end, she got a standing ovation, and you know, the cynical, experienced New York engineers had their minds blown. And so the description of that event and what happened afterwards is in the annals of the Audio Engineering Society as far as these events, that after that point, people were starting to get excited about what's happening. All right, well, that concludes my remarks, and I've left 5 minutes, so I didn't plan very well. I apologize for that. I got a little excited here at the end, as you can tell. But if the lights can come on, is there anybody who would like to share something or a memory or whatever? Yes.
I want to ask a question. I'm sorry I came late. Why 1968? Why did you focus on this year?
Why did I focus on 1968? Well, I was told I had to. No. Yeah. No, I wasn't paid or anything, so I guess I could have done whatever I wanted. But personally, I have 1968 in mind as a year that many of these trends in the country and the concerns and sort of the transition from sort of the vestiges of the 1950s understanding of the place of people in government and what was proper and so forth, transitioned through kind of the hippie Vietnam War era into the 1970s, which I would probably call more of the modern era, where we started having more cynical people who distrusted the institutions around them, people who would have a transition in the technology that was going on. I mean, we were now people who had been able to go to the moon very shortly after this, a year later, basically. Even today, people, you hear people say that remark about how, well, we can land a man on the moon. Why can't we have, solar panels everywhere? So it's kind of, which is actually a good analogy. But so I think that's mainly it. Not a very good answer, but it's just I've always been very intrigued by that, the particular events of that year, and in the context of our current students, I point to that as the kind of thing that America got through that year. It was a mess, and it was terrible, and people were assassinated, and thousands of people were dying, and there were riots everywhere, and protests and things like that. We made it through that. We can do it. Okay. So don't be discouraged.
Well, Rob, at the end of Johnson's term, when he thought he was going to negotiate a peace with Vietnam, I understood that Kissinger had actually been working kind of behind the scenes to squelch that, such that Johnson couldn't claim that as his victory for Nixon to end the war. Have you heard that, or is that true?
I have heard things like that, and I don't personally know whether that's true or not, but it's interesting to contemplate whether there could even be a motivation like that under the circumstances. But the origins of the Vietnam War, again, that's another very interesting and important topic. Yes, sir.
You did a little clip of Laughin, and I was reminded that even though it was a lot of empty-headed comedy, they were just delving into a lot of political and social commentary and dealing quite a bit with censorship, network censorship, as well as the media censors, and Smothers Brothers were losing harder and getting a lot of flack from the network and public reaction, afraid of public reaction.
Yeah, so definitely this tension and friction between the desire for expression and the desire to keep things orderly and not have any turmoil if possible, and that really came out in that. It's a very good point. You had at the same time as this, another show was Carol Burnett. Okay. Yeah. Now Carol Burnett was not as in this edgy kind of political way, but it was a similar style of show. And even up into today, if you look at Saturday Night Live, which formed 75, something like that, that was very much in the same memory and the same kind of thing. Irreverent use of comedy to make a political point.
I don't remember the exact year, but that Dick Tracy cartoon, at the beginning of your lecture you mentioned, who would imagine what we could do with a phone? He had a two-way radio, and then it turned into a two-way TV, and that was right about that time.
Yeah, and did anybody ever think that was actually going to happen? You know, the other thing I remember from this era about whether it was actually going to happen was that there were civil defense exercises going on at this time. And I went to a talk some years ago by a person who had been part of a Red Cross group that went down to the Nevada desert and actually witnessed a nuclear detonation when they were doing them in the atmosphere. So this was, I guess, in the late 50s. And I asked this individual, did you think sometime in your life it was likely that you were going to need to use those skills for real? I mean, did you think you were preparing for an eventuality that might actually happen? And she thought about it for a moment and then said, yes, in fact, she did. And I don't know how many of us that were around in the 50s and 60s in that era, you know, what we thought the future was going to hold. But the likelihood of nuclear war was one of those things which I think has lessened in people's minds today until we have something like the situation in North Korea and nuclear weapons being bandied about. And I remember moving to Montana and realizing that there were airmen in silos not far from here that going from other parts of the country, I had no idea. Didn't even remember that that was still happening and that we still have people vigilant on those nuclear weapons. So it's interesting how time has changed that. Maybe we have time. Who's in? One more. Sir.
I understood that the original spacecraft, though, they had very small computers, like a 64K. Is that true?
Yes, and that would be another talk I would love to give, which is the Apollo guidance computer. And there was one of these on the lunar module and one on the command module. And by today's standards, they are laughable. Sir?
In 1964, we did the work for 10 banks processing with 8K.
Yes. So I tell students about this today when we're talking about things. We were able to navigate and land on the moon and get that spacecraft back using a very rinky-dink little computer, and by today's standards. Of course, at the time, it was a marvel. And originally, NASA had thought that they would do all of the guidance calculations on big IBM mainframes in Houston and just beam the commands up to the spacecraft. And I think they very quickly realized that that was fraught with peril if there should be a communications problem or any kind of error. The spacecraft needed to be able to navigate on their own. And when we came to the Apollo 11, the landing on the moon, if some of you are aficionados of that, there was this call out as the spacecraft was going down to land, and Neil Armstrong was at the controls of this 1201 and 1202 alarms. And it's a geeky thing, but the computer on the spacecraft was overloaded with its operations because Buzz Aldrin had left on a rendezvous radar, and the computer couldn't do all the tasks that it was being asked to do. But they managed to land okay, and they would not have been able to land without that computer. That's the only way you could do it. So a very, very big deal at that time. But again, that's another talk. Okay. And I want to thank the library for hosting this. Very, very pleasant. Appreciate it.
Is there any